Hello, and welcome. I will be talking about Chapter 8 in Ramakantran's book Phantoms in the Brain, and it's titled The Unbearable Likeness of Being. In this chapter, Ramakantran covers a case study of a young man named Arthur who suffers from a rare disorder in which he believes that close family or acquaintances have been replaced by imposters. And this is not very common, but this is a completely sane person believing that his parents have been replaced by people who look exactly like them, and that's not his real parents. So it's a very interesting study, and most of the chapters about this. Now, William Herrnstein, who conducted the study with Ramakantran, explains this a little bit further by saying that us as people, we know people that are close to us by a hybrid representation containing two parts. One part is their external look, how they look and sound, and that stimuli. And the other part is them internally, their personalities, beliefs, characteristics, emotions, and preferences. And Capgras syndrome occurs when the internal portion of the representation is damaged or inaccessible. And this produces an impression of someone who looks right on the outside but seems different on the inside. And that's just because you're not able to feel the same way that you used to about them. So the explanation for Capgras that Ramakantran came up with is really quite novel. So when visual stimuli is being perceived by the visual system, it is sent to the temporal lobe, which specializes in face and object recognition to determine what is being seen. From here, the sensory information is relayed to the amygdala, which helps determine the appropriate emotional response. And once it's sent to the amygdala, and the amygdala decides how to respond to this emotionally, whether that's fight, flight, or mate, or a mix of the two, or in intensity or whatever, then that emotion is generated by the limbic system, and that's when you feel excited or depressed or scared or whatever emotion that you're feeling. And the limbic system triggers the other parts of your body from the thalamus and so forth. The issue of Capgras syndrome arises when there is selective damage along this pathway, and somewhere along it, the signal is interrupted and it doesn't get through to the amygdala, and therefore no emotional response. Now, the repercussions of this disconnect are quite severe. Patients with Capgras syndrome, the ventral pathway remains intact, whereas the dorsal pathway is impaired. Thus, patients who have the syndrome are often characterized by the absence of emotional feelings towards the persons of their own family. So they recognize them on the outside, they see who they're looking at, they look exactly the same, but because that visual input isn't making it to the amygdala, and the amygdala is not able to trigger the appropriate emotional response, there is no emotional response to them, and so they pretty much just view them as a stranger. Now, the truly cruel part of this disorder or this syndrome is the fact that it mostly affects the people that are closest to you. So that means that you're not necessarily going to feel like the mailman or a stranger who you don't really know is an imposter, because you never really had an emotional connection to them, and so you don't feel that, as Ramakantran states, that warm glow of emotional attachment, and that's why they're just other random people that you don't really have a connection to. But when it comes to your mother, your father, husband, brother, whatever it may be, you're used to producing an emotional reaction when you see that person, some kind of arousal, and when that isn't triggered inside the person, they're used to that. They have that baseline of how it used to be, and when they don't get that anymore, their brain knows something is off, but they don't know what is off. So the only thing the brain can do is jump to the next logical conclusion, which is that that's a person who looks the same, but it's not the same person because there is no emotional connection. And that's just the brain searching for a reason, a way to explain that. So this was tested on Arthur by using galvanic skin response test, and they showed him images of strangers, and they also displayed images of his parents, and there was essentially no response, no arousal to his parents. Whereas in normal people who don't have this disorder, they displayed arousal. A couple other interesting case study discoveries. He could recognize his real parents over the phone and feel that emotional connection to them and that warm glow. But when he visually saw them, there was no such connection, no such emotional response, which is interesting. But Ramachandran explains this because the auditory pathway to the amygdala is a different one than the visual one, and if only the visual one was damaged, the auditory pathway would work just fine and still trigger that appropriate emotional response. Whereas for visual stimuli, that signal will be interrupted. There was also several other interesting ones that were not explained as much, such as how a minor change in the direction of the gaze was enough for Arthur to think that it's a completely different person that is looking at him or that he's seeing. He seemed to have some issues grouping visual categories of objects and concepts of certain things, which was also an interesting side effect, I should say. And another thing is Arthur also duplicated himself. He not only thought that his parents were imposters, there was also instances of him when he thought he was an imposter, that he wasn't, that he was shown a picture of himself, and he said that that's a different Arthur, that's not him. And he once said that to his parents, and he said, if the real Arthur comes back, will you still love me and treat me as a friend? Which is really quite bizarre. And also in this chapter, there was several other related syndromes that were mentioned. The first was Fregoli syndrome, which is essentially the opposite of Capgras syndrome, and it's a rare condition in which the patient keeps seeing the same person everywhere. So instead of not actually recognizing that person and thinking it's somebody else, they actually see that person everywhere, even when it's not them. And this is likely to be an excess of connections between facial recognition and the amygdala, so you're triggering that response, that emotional response to every face you see or many faces. And then there was Cotard syndrome, which is an illness in which the patient believes that they're dead. And this one's even more rare, but it's kind of the extreme of Capgras syndrome. And this is where essentially Ramachandran believes that they're not getting any emotional responses to any stimuli, any sensory stimuli. So, whether it's their skin, whatever it is, they're not getting any stimuli, and so they're essentially stranded on an island of emotional desolation, which is pretty much as close as anyone can get to experiencing death. Which is actually a very interesting. There was actually an interesting case study where a man thought he was dead, and he told his son he should go to the tax department and report his death. And the son tried to argue with him and say that he's not dead, but he kept on saying that he's dead. And the son asked him if he could hear his own heartbeat, and he said he can't do that because he's not a doctor. So he actually denied everything and actually tried to argue with it, even though it was obvious that it wasn't true. So that was interesting. And there's also the Capgras syndrome, when somebody thought their cat was an imposter. Yeah, that's it.